it's Christy. I'm so excited to be back with you on the Lawnfawn YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using winter birds and Scripty autumn sentiments. So I've stamped those images out on Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Lawnfawn Jet Black ink, and I'll be coloring with my Copic markers. I'm starting with my birds, and I really wanted to try to create blue jays today. So I pulled out some bright blue tones. I'm using B21, B24, B26, and B29. And I'm starting with my darkest shade, that B29, and beginning to lay in some shadows and also just deepen up the edges of the wings and the tail and the top of the head. And I'll be adding even more darkness to that in a little bit, but I wanted to start with the blues. So once I have that laid in, I'm going to blend out with the B26. And then I'll bring in the B24 and carry that even further down the wings, very close to the body, and also bring that forward on the head and the tail. I'm going to fill in the side of the head and just leave a little sliver of space there for that B21 right above the beak on the forehead. And then I'll use that B21 to transition into the colors I'm going to bring in next, which are C0 and C1. So I'm going to blend that C1 right over the edge of the B21, and these two transition fairly well together. I'll also add a little bit of shading up around the face, and then fill in the rest of that white space with the C0. And then I did go back and add a little extra of that C1 for some added definition. So I'm going to color the other two birds pretty much the same, using the same shades, and I didn't think about it until after I was done filming, but it would have been cool to try to make one of these a female blue jay. Then they would have just been a little less colorful. They still have the blue on the head, but they're a little bit more muted on the rest of the body, a little bit more gray toned, but I didn't think of that in time, so it's fine. They're just going to all be male blue jays, but they'll be nice and colorful for the card. So I did add a little bit of that B21 down at the bottom of the belly of this one that's facing completely forward, just to help transition into the grays so it looks like, you know, the blue tail is back behind. And then for the last one, I'm going to color it the same, just doing my shadows on the right hand side so that they still fall on the tip of the tail and the edge of the wings and the very top of the little crown of their head. And I really love these vibrant blues. I think there's something a little bit unexpected for the fall season. Traditionally, everything is really warm toned and muted, but I think this beautiful sapphire blue is really stunning. And sapphire is the birthstone of September, which is my birthday month, so I think it's fun to have that nice pop of like sapphire blue. So next I'm going to add in C3, C5, and C7. The C7 I'm going to just place on the very edges of the wings and tail and the crown of the head to add that little bit of black detail that blue jays always have. And I decided to go with the C7 because I thought that was dark enough. I didn't want to do like a too deeply saturated black. And then for the beak, I'm using C5 and then blending out with the C3 because blue jays do have a gray beak instead of an orange one. And then I'm going to move on to some grayish tones for my tree branches. I thought that would be nice for fall. I really love these shades, especially in the fall. So I'm using E71, E74, and E77. Adding that E77 down at the bottom edge of the branches and blending up with the E74. And each of those branches is kind of divided into 3 parts, which made it very easy to figure out where to put your 3 shades if you're going with a dark, a medium, and a light. So the highlight obviously will go up at the top because that's where the sun would hit. So I just filled in all of that white space with the E71. And then I'm going to bring in E79 and use that to do my pine cones, adding just a touch of darkness up under each of the little sections of the pine cone. And then I'll blend that out with the E77, just adding a very quick little touch of the marker because some of those spaces are super tiny and I definitely want to leave a little bit of room for my highlight to really help those to pop and for you to see the separation of each of those little individual edges of the pine cone. And for that I use the E74 to fill those in. Then I'm going to add some of these tones to the leaves. I'm going to bring in E70, and this time I'm starting with the E74 as the darkest and just adding a little bit of that to each of the leaves, blending out with the E71, and then I'll bring in a little bit of that E70, and I tried to put it at a different place on each of the leaves just so they don't all look the same, even though I'm going to have the same color palette on all of them. Next, I'm going to bring in some dusty pink shades with R81, R83, and R85. I used that R81 to add some rosy cheeks to all of my birds. And then I'm going to do the scarf on the bird down at the bottom, just starting with that R85 on the back where the light wouldn't hit as much and at the top of the folded fabric, and then blending out with the other two shades. And then I'll add a little bit of that to each of the leaves as well. And just always trying to make the lightest shade be the one that's going to transition into the other shades that I'm going to mix on the leaves so that they really incorporate well together. Then I'm going to bring in some peach tones with YR000, YR00, and YR12. I guess it's more of maybe a rusty peach, more of like a very pale orange. And I'll do another one of the scarves, and I did do a second layer on that just to intensify the saturation. And then I'll add a little bit of that to each of the leaves, starting with that YR12 and then blending out with the YR00, and then I'll add a little bit of that YR triple in there as well. And just making sure to blend over some of the previous colors that are on those leaves so they really do combine nicely and look pretty seamless. And then my last color combo is going to be a warm yellow, and I'm using Y11 with YR20 and YR21. The YR20 and 21 really add that kind of dull, desaturated color palette that the other shades have, and then the Y11 just warms it up and makes it a little bit more sunny and bright. So I really like that. And I used 2 layers on the final scarf and then added that to the rest of the leaves as well. That smallest one got filled in completely, but that's okay. I'm just going to color right over some of the other shades so that I have a little bit of that warm tone on that leaf as well. And you'll see that especially when I add in the Y11. Then I took a black Sakura jelly roll pen and went over the eyes of my birds that have their eyes open, and then I trimmed these images out with their matching dies. For my background, I'm starting with a piece of Bristol smooth surface cardstock, and I'm going to use the Lawnfawn Cloudy stencil to add on some Distress Oxide inks and create a sky. The first shade that I'm starting with is Faded Jeans, and I'm using just the tiniest amount of that and then blending it out using tumbled glass, because I just want a little bit of depth there, and then I want it to soften into the lighter blue. I don't want to create like a stormy sky, I just want it to be a fall sky, and I want to have a little bit more of a desaturated hue to match the coloring that I did with my Copics, other than the birds, of course, because those are pretty bright. But all the accessory images were more of a desaturated hue, so I want my sky to match that. and also it won't be in competition with my birds. So I'm always adding just a little bit of that faded jeans right as I leave the stencil, not going up too high. And then I will add in the tumbled glass and take that up almost all the way to the previous cloud, but I still want to leave a little bit of white space where the cloud is so that they're clearly defined. And then I just turn that stencil each time until I get a different cloud formation that I like, and I can shift that stencil a little bit to the left or the right, or even flip it over if I need to get a different orientation of those clouds. So I've added 4 different clouds, and then I'm going to take those colors and add a little bit extra down at the bottom so it all has that dreamy feel and they're not too stark white down at the bottom, because this is going to be up in the sky. We're not going to have any ground showing in the scene. I just wanted the tree branches to be up higher. And then once I am done blending that out and I'm happy with how it's looking, I will take both of those inks and smush some onto an acrylic block. And then I'll add a little bit of water to each of those, and also just some clear water in the center of the block. So just a little spritz, and then I'll pick up first the plain water with my paintbrush and tap that off the edge of the block. I'm using a fine tip paintbrush so I get super fine splatters. And then I'll add a little bit of the mixed up tumbled glass, and then finally a little bit of that mixed up faded jeans until everything is just has that little fine spray that I think adds a really nice touch to the card. It just gives so much movement and texture to your scene. Next, I'm going to work on my sentiment. So I'm stamping the word grateful from Scripty Autumn Sentiments with Blue Jay ink onto another piece of Bristol so that the white edge will match the white of the focal panel. And I'm going to stamp that down twice to make sure I have a nice dark impression. And then I'll pop that out of my MISTI, and I will pop my focal panel in instead. I've trimmed that down with the largest of the small stitch rectangle stackables, and I'm stamping out I'm So Very in VersaFine Onyx Black ink. It's just a very crisp ink that lays well over the distress oxides. And then I will pop my card base in my MISTI. I'm using lawnfawn speckled eggshell cardstock and going back to my Blue Jay ink. And I took another bird from Winter Birds, and the rest of the sentiment is from Scripty Autumn Sentiments. So next I wanted to use a little bit of pattern paper on my card, so I'm pulling out the favorite flannel 6x6 petite pack, and I'm going to take this kind of mulberry colored diagonal plaid, and I'll trim that out with the largest of the large stitch rectangle stackables. And then I'm going to work on my focal panel, and I've put foam tape behind all of my images, including that grateful sentiment. I did have to cut down some very tiny little slivers of that Scotch 3M foam tape, but I think it's worth it because it adds so much dimension on your card. So I'm going to add that grateful underneath the rest of the stamped sentiment. Make sure it's on there nice and straight, and then I'll pop that down. And then I can lay out the rest of my scene. I have the release papers still on that foam tape so that I can make sure that everything fits before I start to stick things down. So once I have an idea of how the space is going to be, I can start popping down some of these images. I'm going to add the flying bird right above the stamped part of the sentiment, and then I will stagger the 2 branches so that they hang over the edge of the focal panel, one on the right and one on the left. Then I'll put the bird that is facing completely forward up at the top, and I wanted him to be just a little bit lower in the scene, so I just readjusted that branch and then popped him back behind it so he's standing on that branch and his little feet are kind of tucked behind. And that made me adjust the lower branch as well, just slightly. And to that one, I'm going to add the 2 pine cones on that lower little stub of a branch that's sticking out. And then my third bird is going to be sitting on that branch. And then I have my leaves that I want to scatter throughout the scene. So I'm going to lay those out again before I peel off those release papers and just make sure that I have a layout that I like. And then once I'm happy with it, I can start to put those down permanently. And I'm just making sure to turn them in different directions so that they don't all look exactly the same. They're coming from different areas and the stems are pointing up or down or left or right. So it really looks like a blustery fall day with the wind kind of coming from all different directions. It just adds a lot of movement to the scene. So once I'm done with that, I can go back to my card base and add my pattern paper to the front of my card. I'm going to glue that down with the glue tube and just make sure that all the corners are lined up nice and straight. Smooth that into place, and then I will glue the focal panel to that card front as well, just centering that on the scene. And then once I have that, I'm going to clip off the overhang of the 2 branches so that the branches kind of extend beyond the scene a little bit out into that pattern paper. I just think that's a fun look. I wanted to add a little bit of sparkle to this card, and I really love to pull out the platinum stickles at this time of year and just add a little bit to the leaves. I don't want to add too much because it does cover up the coloring, so I'm mainly sticking to the centers of the leaves where those lines are drawn and just adding a tiny bit of sparkle. And then I wanted to add a little extra detail to the scarves of my birds. So I'm going back and pulling out some matching tones and just adding a little bit of detail with my Copic markers. So I added polka dots to the pink scarf, and then I'm going to pull out YR14 and add some stripes to the pale orange scarf. I had to turn the card a bit to keep my hands out of the stickles. If I'd thought of it, I should have done it first, but that's okay. And then I'm pulling out YR24 and I'm going to do a little plaid pattern on the yellow scarf. And then once I'm done with that, I wanted to add a little extra glitter to those as well. And this time I'm going to use Stardust Stickles because this one doesn't cover up your coloring too much. It still lets the shades shine through. So just to have a little bit extra sparkle, I think you can never really have too much. So that is going to finish off this card. I'll lift that up so you can see all of that shimmer and give you another peek at the inside. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this one, and seeing how a winter stamp set can definitely work for fall depending on what you pair it with. If you did like it, please be sure to leave me a comment down below and let me know. I love to hear from you guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have an amazing day. Bye-bye.